They laughed when the elderly couple offered just $3. But minutes later, that same crowd stood frozen in silence, because what they found inside that broken mini home felt almost impossible to explain. The auction yard smelled of dust, rust, and forgotten stories. People moved from one item to another with casual indifference, scanning, judging, discarding with their eyes before the auctioneer could even finish his sentence. Old chairs, cracked mirrors, worn-out cabinets, each object carried a past, but no one cared enough to imagine it. For most, it was just a place to find something cheap, or to pass time on a dull afternoon. In the middle of that restless crowd stood an elderly couple, quiet and almost invisible. Their clothes were simple, slightly faded with time but neatly pressed. The man leaned slightly on a wooden cane, his movements slow but steady. The woman stood close to him, her hands gently folded, her eyes observing everything with a softness that didn't match the harsh energy around them. They weren't there for entertainment like the others. There was something different in the way they looked at things, as if they were searching, not just seeing. A loud bang echoed as the auctioneer struck his gavel against the table. His voice carried across the yard, practiced and impatient. He had done this hundreds of times, maybe thousands. To him, every item was just another transaction, another number. "Next item," he called out, barely glancing at the paper in his hand. "A structure, if you can call it that." A few people chuckled. Heads turned lazily toward the far corner of the yard where the item stood. It was a tiny mini home, barely large enough to be called a house. The paint was peeling off in uneven patches, exposing the raw wood beneath. One window was cracked, the other covered with a sheet of plastic that flapped slightly in the breeze. The door leaned awkwardly, as if it had given up trying to stay upright years ago. Someone in the crowd let out a low whistle. "That thing, about to fall apart." Another voice added, "You'd spend more fixing it than it's worth." Laughter rippled through the group, quick and careless. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Starting bid, $10. Silence. Not the kind of silence filled with anticipation, but the kind that comes when no one is interested. People shifted their weight, some checked their phones, others simply looked away as if the item didn't deserve their attention. $10, the auctioneer repeated, tapping the gavel lightly. "Anyone?" "Nothing." A man near the front crossed his arms and smirked. "You'd have to pay me $10 to take that." More laughter followed. The mood was light, dismissive, almost cruel in its indifference. The elderly couple stood still, their eyes fixed on the small structure. While everyone else saw decay, they seemed to see something else, something hidden beneath the broken exterior. The woman took a small step forward, her gaze lingering on the doorway. There was a flicker of emotion in her eyes, something fragile and uncertain. She leaned slightly toward her husband, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something about it." The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the mini home, studying it with quiet intensity. He shifted his grip on the cane, as if grounding himself. "I don't know why," she continued softly, "but it feels familiar." He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Around them, the crowd had already moved on mentally, waiting for the next item that might actually be worth their time. But for this couple, time seemed to slow down. The auctioneer sighed, clearly ready to move on. "All right if there are no bids." A slight movement interrupted him. The old man lifted his hand. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't confident. His hand trembled slightly, rising just enough to be noticed. "I'll give $3, he said. For a moment, the entire yard went still. Then, as if on cue, laughter erupted. Not polite laughter, not even surprised laughter. It was loud, mocking, almost disbelieving. $3, someone repeated, shaking his head. "You serious?" Another voice called out. "That thing isn't worth 3 cents. The man with crossed arms stepped forward slightly, grinning. "Let them have it. Saves us the trouble of throwing it away." More laughter. A few people clapped sarcastically, as if applauding a joke. The elderly woman lowered her gaze for a brief moment, but there was no shame in her expression, just quiet patience. She reached for her husband's arm, her touch gentle but steady, as if reminding him that they were there together. The auctioneer looked at them, then at the crowd. He hesitated, not out of concern but mild confusion. He had seen strange bids before, but this felt different. $3, he repeated, almost testing the words. No one else spoke. No one challenged the bid. Why would they? To them it was worthless. The auctioneer shrugged, going once. A pause. Going twice. The wind brushed through the yard, carrying the faint creak of the old mini home in the distance. Sold $3. The gavel struck the table with a sharp crack. Just like that, it was over. The crowd quickly lost interest, already turning their attention to the next item. Conversations resumed, laughter faded into background noise, and the moment dissolved as if it had never mattered. But for the elderly couple, everything had changed. The man lowered his hand slowly, his fingers still slightly trembling. The woman looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. He nodded, though his expression carried a hint of uncertainty. "I don't know why, but I had to." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by people who had already forgotten them. To everyone else, it was just a foolish purchase, a pointless decision made by two people who didn't know better. But as they turned their gaze back toward the mini home, something shifted in the air between them. The laughter, the judgment, the dismissive stares, it all faded into the background. Because deep down, beneath the confusion and the doubt, there was a feeling neither of them could explain, a quiet pull that refused to be ignored. The crowd had already moved on, their attention drifting toward louder bids and shinier objects, but the elderly couple remained where they were for a moment longer, as if their feet refused to follow the noise. The receipt for their purchase felt almost weightless in the old man's hand, yet it carried something heavier than either of them could explain. $3. That was all it had taken, not just to buy a broken structure, but to awaken a feeling that neither of them could name. They began walking toward the far corner of the yard where the mini home stood. With each step, the world around them seemed to grow quieter. The chatter faded, the laughter blurred, and even the sharp voice of the auctioneer became distant. It was as if something invisible was guiding them forward, pulling them gently but firmly toward that worn-out place. Up close, the mini home looked even more fragile. The wood was rough to the touch, splintered in places where time had not been kind. The paint had almost completely given up, leaving behind faint traces of what might have once been a soft, welcoming color. The window covering fluttered slightly, making a soft tapping sound against the frame. The woman stopped just a few steps away. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes moved carefully over every detail, not with judgment, but with recognition, like someone trying to remember a dream that was just out of reach. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. The old man didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, his cane pressing gently into the ground with each movement. He reached out his hand toward the outer wall, hesitating just before his fingers made contact. There was a pause, long enough to feel something shift inside him. Then he touched it. The moment his skin brushed against the wood, something unexpected passed through him. Not a shock, not fear, but a strange warmth. It wasn't physical, yet it was undeniable. His fingers lingered there, tracing the rough surface slowly, as if trying to read something written into it. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I feel like I've been here before." The woman's eyes widened slightly. She stepped closer too, placing her hand just below his on the wall. The same stillness surrounded her as she closed her eyes for a brief second. There was no clear memory, no image, no sound she could hold on to, just a feeling deep, quiet, and familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. "I don't understand it," she whispered, But it doesn't feel new, it feels like something we lost. A soft breeze passed between them, carrying a faint scent of old wood and dust. Yet to them, it felt like something more, something almost comforting. The man moved toward the door. It hung slightly crooked, the hinges creaking softly as it shifted in place. He studied it carefully, his eyes narrowing as if trying to recognize its shape, its texture, its presence. His hand rose again, this time toward the door handle. For a moment he hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. A quiet uncertainty, as if opening that door might reveal something they weren't ready to face. The woman noticed his pause. She stepped closer, her hand gently resting on his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "We'll see it together." He nodded slowly, drawing a steady breath. Then, with careful movement, he pushed the door open. The sound it made was long and drawn out, a tired creak that echoed slightly in the stillness around them. Inside, the air felt different. Cooler, heavier. Dust floated in thin streams of sunlight that slipped through the cracked window. The space was small, almost too small to imagine living in, yet there was something about it that didn't feel empty. The woman stepped in first, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light. She looked around, her gaze moving from one corner to another, taking in every detail with quiet intensity. An old chair stood near the wall, its surface worn smooth in places where hands must have rested countless times. A small table leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been nudged and never corrected. The floor creaked softly beneath their steps, each sound echoing more than it should have in such a small space. But it wasn't the objects that held their attention. It was the feeling. The man entered behind her, closing the door gently. The outside world disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a silence that felt alive rather than empty. He took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the room. There was no clear reason for the tightness in his chest, no explanation for the way his breath seemed to slow on its own. "It feels like someone just left," he murmured. The woman nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the far wall. "I was thinking the same thing." She moved closer to that wall, her steps careful, almost hesitant. There was nothing particularly special about it at first glance, just faded wood, slightly darker in some areas, lighter in others. But something about it drew her in. She reached out her hand, placing her fingers gently against the surface. The moment she did, her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Her brows softened, her lips parted slightly. A faint, almost forgotten emotion flickered across her face. "Why does this feel so important?" she whispered. The man joined her, standing just beside her now. He looked at the same spot on the wall, though he couldn't see anything unusual. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it feels like we're standing in the middle of something we're supposed to remember." They stood there in silence for a few seconds, both lost in the same unexplainable connection. There were no answers, only questions that seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. The woman slowly lowered her hand, her fingers lingering just a second longer before pulling away. "We shouldn't feel this way about a place we've never seen before," she said softly. The man looked around the room again, more carefully this time. Every detail seemed sharper now, more meaningful, even if he couldn't explain why. "That's the strange part," he replied. "It doesn't feel like something new, it feels like something we forgot." The silence inside the mini home deepened as they stood there, both trying to understand the weight of what they were feeling. It wasn't just familiarity anymore. It was something closer, something sharper, like a memory trying to push its way through but still hidden behind a thin veil. The woman moved first. Her eyes, still drawn to the far wall, began to notice something she hadn't seen before. A faint outline, slightly darker than the surrounding wood. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing away a thin layer of dust. And then she froze. Her breath caught midair. Wait, she whispered. The man turned quickly, his expression shifting from quiet curiosity to concern. What is it? She didn't answer right away. Her hand trembled slightly as she wiped more of the dust away, slowly, carefully, revealing what had been hidden beneath time. A photograph. Faded, edges worn, colors nearly gone. But not gone enough. The man stepped closer, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he tried to focus. Then suddenly, his entire body stiffened. No, he murmured. The photograph showed a young couple standing in front of a small home. Smiling, hopeful, and in the woman's arms a baby. The elderly woman's lips began to tremble. Her eyes filled with tears so quickly it was as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. That's us, she said, her voice breaking. The man didn't speak. He couldn't. His eyes remained locked on the image, scanning every detail as if trying to prove it wrong. But there was no mistake. The young man in the photograph, strong, upright, full of life, was him. And the woman beside him, glowing with quiet happiness, was her. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Not empty, but overwhelming. The kind of silence that carries years inside it. How is this possible? The woman whispered, barely able to stand. Her knees weakened slightly, and she reached for the nearby wall to steady herself. The man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, though his own hands were shaking just as much. This place, he said slowly, his voice uneven, this was our home. The words hung in the air, fragile yet undeniable. And just like that, everything began to shift. Not all at once, not clearly. But enough. Fragments of the past began to stir, faint, scattered, like pieces of a broken mirror catching light one by one. The sound of laughter. A baby crying in the distance. The warmth of sunlight entering through a window that no longer existed the same way. The woman stepped back slightly, her eyes scanning the room again. But this time, she wasn't just seeing what was there. She was seeing what used to be. The table, she said suddenly, pointing toward the small, uneven piece of furniture in the corner. It used to be right here, but it was new, and there was a cloth on it, blue, I think. Her voice trailed off, uncertain but hopeful. The man turned toward it slowly. He walked over, running his hand across its surface. And something clicked. You used to place flowers here, he said quietly. Every morning, even when we couldn't afford much, you still did that. The woman let out a soft, emotional breath. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I did. Tears rolled down her cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. Because for the first time in years, they meant something. The man moved further into the room, his steps slightly faster now, not out of urgency, but out of a growing need to remember. He looked down at the floor. Something fell off. He tapped his cane gently against one spot. A hollow sound echoed back. He paused, then crouched down slowly, setting the cane aside. What are you doing? The woman asked, her voice still unsteady. I think there's something here. His fingers began to move against the wooden surface, feeling for edges, for lines that didn't belong. And then he found it. A loose board. Carefully, he pried it open. Dust rose into the air as the wood lifted, revealing a small, hidden space beneath. Inside, an envelope. Old, yellowed, sealed but fragile. The woman stepped closer, her heart racing. Open it, she said softly. The man hesitated for just a moment, then slowly opened the envelope. Inside was money. Carefully folded bills. Preserved. Untouched. They both stared at it in disbelief. This can't be, the man said, his voice barely audible. The woman covered her mouth, overwhelmed. We saved this, she whispered. We were going to use it for a better life, for something important. Her voice broke again. And then we lost everything. The room seemed to grow smaller around them, as if the past and present were folding into each other. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The woman turned toward a small drawer near the wall, one she hadn't paid much attention to before. Something about it felt familiar. She walked toward it slowly, almost afraid of what she might find. Her hand rested on the handle. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened it. Inside, a small wooden box. Simple, unlocked. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out and opened the lid. And just like that, the tears came harder than before. Letters. Dozens of them. Carefully folded, some tied with a thin string. The man stepped closer, his breath catching. "No way," he whispered. The woman picked one up, her fingers tracing the edges. "I remember these," she said softly. "We used to write to each other, even when we lived in the same house, just to say the things we couldn't always say out loud." She unfolded one slowly. Her eyes moved across the faded ink. And as she read, her expression softened into something deeper than sadness. It was love. Pure, enduring, unchanged. The man looked around the room again, but this time, there was no confusion left. Every corner held a memory. Every object told a story. This wasn't just a random discovery. This wasn't coincidence. This was their life. Hidden, forgotten, and somehow, returned to them by the next morning. Word had already spread far beyond the dusty auction yard. What had started as a moment of laughter had quietly turned into something people couldn't stop talking about. The same voices that mocked the old couple were now filled with curiosity, disbelief, and a strange urgency to know more. People began to gather again near the mini home. Not because it looked any better, it didn't. The cracked windows still rattled in the wind, the paint still peeled, and the door still leaned as if it might fall at any moment. But now, there was something different in the air. The place that once seemed worthless had suddenly become a mystery no one could ignore. The elderly couple stood just outside, side by side. They looked tired, but not in the way people usually are. It was the kind of tiredness that comes after something deeply emotional, something that changes you from the inside. Yet despite that, there was a quiet calm in their expressions, as if they had finally found something they didn't even know they were missing. The man from the auction, the same one who had laughed the loudest, stepped forward through the small crowd. His arms were no longer crossed with arrogance. Instead, his posture carried a hint of hesitation. "So," he said, trying to sound casual but failing slightly, "we heard there's something special about this place now." The old man looked at him, not with anger, not with pride, but with a steady, thoughtful gaze. For a moment he said nothing, as if choosing his words carefully. "It was always special," he replied quietly. A murmur passed through the crowd. Another voice called out, "Come on, don't keep us guessing. What did you find in there?" The woman glanced at her husband, her eyes soft but certain. He gave a small nod. Slowly she stepped forward. Her hands held something fragile, a bundle of old letters, tied together with a thin, worn string. The paper had aged, the edges slightly curled, but it was clear they had been kept with care. "These," she said gently, "were inside." Someone in the crowd leaned closer. "Old papers, that's it." A few people exchanged confused looks. The tension that had built up didn't match what they were seeing. The man who had mocked them frowned slightly. "You're telling us this is what all the talk is about." The old woman didn't react to the tone. Instead, she carefully untied the string and unfolded one of the letters. Her fingers moved slowly, almost reverently, as if she was holding something far more valuable than it appeared. "We wrote these," she said softly, "many years ago." The crowd fell a little quieter. The old man stepped beside her now, holding the faded photograph they had found on the wall. He raised it just enough for the people closest to see. A few gasps broke through the silence. "Is that you?" someone asked, disbelief clear in their voice. He nodded. "That's us," he said, "and that little home behind us is this one." A wave of whispers spread through the group. People leaned in, trying to see better, trying to understand. "But how is that possible?" another voice questioned. "This place has been abandoned for years." The old man took a slow breath, his eyes briefly scanning the structure behind him. "We lost it," he said simply, "a long time ago." There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to build suspense, just a quiet truth spoken without bitterness. "We had nothing back then," he continued. "Life wasn't easy. We struggled more than most people knew, and eventually we couldn't keep this place anymore." The woman lowered her gaze slightly, her fingers still resting on the letters. "We thought everything we left behind was gone forever," she added. The crowd listened now, not out of curiosity alone but something deeper. The tone had changed. The laughter from the day before felt distant, almost embarrassing in comparison. "And the money?" the man from the auction asked, his voice softer now. "Is that part true?" The old man nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "we found it hidden under the floor." A ripple of surprise moved through the group again. "We had saved it," the woman explained. "Every little bit we could, hoping one day it would help us build something better." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "But life doesn't always wait for your plans," she continued. "We lost the house before we could ever use it." Silence settled again. This time it wasn't empty. It was heavy. Because now the story wasn't about a cheap purchase or a strange discovery. It was about something real, something human. The man who had laughed before looked down for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I didn't know," he admitted. The old man gave a faint, understanding nod. "You weren't supposed to," he said. Another person spoke up, their voice filled with a mix of curiosity and wonder. "So what are you going to do now?" The question hung in the air. The couple exchanged a glance. There was no hesitation this time. "We're staying," the woman said gently. A few people blinked in surprise. "Staying," someone repeated, "here." The old man turned slightly, looking at the mini home once more. The broken edges, the faded wood, the years of neglect, it was all still there. But now it didn't look the same. "This place held our beginning," he said quietly, "and somehow it found its way back to us." He paused for a moment, his voice softening even more. "We don't need it to be perfect," he added. "We just need it to be ours again." The crowd stood still, absorbing his words. No one laughed this time. No one made a joke. Because something had shifted, something deeper than curiosity or surprise. The value of that tiny, broken home had changed completely. Not because of money. Not because of what was found inside. But because of what it meant. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Where there had once been neglect, there was now movement. Where there had been silence, there were now soft sounds of effort, patience, and care. The elderly couple returned to the mini home every morning, not with grand plans or expensive tools, but with something far more powerful: intention. The man arrived first most days, his cane pressing gently into the ground as he walked. In his other hand he carried small tools, nothing new, nothing shiny, just simple things that had lasted as long as he had. The woman followed closely, often holding a small cloth, a bucket, or sometimes nothing at all except quiet determination. They didn't rush. They didn't try to fix everything at once. Instead, they started with what they could touch. The door was the first thing they worked on. It had been hanging unevenly, its hinges worn and weak. The man carefully removed it, his movements slow but steady. The woman stood beside him, holding it gently as if it were something fragile, something worth protecting. "You remember this door?" she asked softly. He paused, looking at it closely. A faint smile appeared. "You used to decorate it," he said. "Little things, ribbons, sometimes flowers." She nodded, her eyes soft with memory. "I wanted it to feel welcoming," she replied. Together they fixed it, not perfectly, but enough. When they placed it back, it still creaked, but now it stood straight. And somehow that was enough. Inside, the changes were even more meaningful. The woman began cleaning slowly, wiping away years of dust, one surface at a time. Every movement revealed something new, not just objects, but memories tied to them. The small table was cleaned carefully, its uneven legs adjusted just enough to stand properly again. She placed a simple cloth over it. Not blue like before, she couldn't find the exact one, but close enough. The man noticed immediately. "It looks right," he said. She smiled. Each day brought a new piece of the past back to life. The hidden letters were carefully placed in a small box, no longer forgotten beneath dust and time. The photograph was cleaned and hung again, this time not as a discovery, but as a reminder. And the money they had found. They didn't rush to spend it. They didn't treat it as luck or fortune. Instead, they saw it for what it truly was, a piece of their younger selves, preserved through time, returned not to change their future, but to reconnect them with their past. "We saved this once," the woman said one evening, holding the envelope gently. "Maybe now we use it differently." The man nodded. "Not for something bigger," he added, "but for something meaningful." Word continued to spread, but this time it didn't bring laughter. It brought people. At first, just a few curious faces stopped by, standing at a distance, watching quietly. Then one neighbor stepped forward, offering a small can of paint. "It's not much," he said awkwardly, "but maybe it helps." The old man accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he replied simply. Then another person came, carrying a few tools. Someone else brought wood scraps. A young boy showed up one afternoon, asking if he could help clean. Slowly, without planning, without asking, the people who once dismissed the place began to become part of its transformation. There was no announcement, no grand project. Just small acts of kindness, building something bigger than anyone expected. The man who had laughed the loudest returned too. He stood quietly at the edge for a long moment before stepping closer. "I was wrong," he admitted. The old couple didn't react with surprise. They simply looked at him. "It happens," the old man said calmly. The younger man hesitated, then gestured toward the house. "Let me help," he said. And just like that, he did. Days turned into weeks. The mini home didn't become luxurious. It didn't turn into something modern or impressive. But it became something far more powerful. It became alive again. The walls, once faded and forgotten, were now warm with color. The window was repaired, allowing sunlight to flow freely inside. The floor, though still old, no longer felt weak beneath their steps. Every corner held a story, but now those stories were no longer buried. They were visible, felt, shared. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden light through the window, the couple sat together inside. The same place where they had once stood in confusion was now filled with quiet peace. The woman rested her head gently against her husband's shoulder. "It's not the same as before," she said softly. He looked around, taking in the space. "No," he agreed, "it's not." She lifted her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the warm light. "It feels better," she added. He smiled. "Because now we understand it," he said. There was a long pause, not uncomfortable but full. Full of everything they had lost. And everything they had found again. Outside, the people who had helped slowly drifted away, returning to their own lives. But something had changed in them too. The way they looked at things, the way they judged value, it wasn't the same anymore. Because they had seen something rare. Not a miracle. Not magic. But something real. Something human. The old man reached for the woman's hand, holding it gently, just as he had done years ago. "We came here with nothing," he said quietly. She nodded. "And we still don't have much," she replied. He looked at her, his expression soft but certain. "We have enough," he said. The camera slowly pulls back. The tiny home, once ignored, now stands quietly under the fading sky, not perfect, not grand, but whole. And inside it, two people sit side by side, not thinking about what they lost, but grateful for what they found again. Because sometimes, life doesn't give you something new. Sometimes, it brings you back to what truly mattered all along. Moral: true value is never measured by price or appearance. The things that seem small, broken, or forgotten often carry the deepest meaning. When you look beyond the surface, with patience, with heart, you may discover that what you already have, or what you once lost, is more valuable than anything you could ever buy. This story is created for emotional storytelling and inspirational purposes. While it reflects real-life themes and human experiences, certain elements may be dramatized to enhance the narrative impact.